some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. People were also bringing babies to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. When the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. But Jesus called the children to him and said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please do take your seats. If you were here last week, you remember we began a short series, just 3 weeks we're thinking together about giving and money. And in the midst of some of the bits of paper, hopefully you received on the way in, you'll find a leaflet with more information about our current financial situation at St. Bartholomew's, and with a particular invitation to everyone who sort of consider themselves a regular member or supporter, I suppose, of this church, to consider their regular giving into 2024. Part of the reason we're thinking about giving at this time is that in November's PCC meeting, the PCC will be thinking about our budget for 2024, and it's useful to have an accurate sense of where our kind of pledged, envisaged giving for the next calendar year what it will look like, and therefore what sort of plans ought we to make as a church. It's not the only factors we think about, how the Lord is calling us to serve him with the money that the PCC has available, but it is a big factor. And so I would invite you to take away that leaflet. There's a return to bring back over the next few weeks. Try to give everyone time, so we're not making knee-jerk reactions. We're thinking and praying about our own giving. And part of the point of this series is that, if you like, sort of feed into, give us things to think about as a church community as we consider how we want to respond to God with all of our lives, including our wallets and our credit cards and our checkbooks and so on. But you might remember last week, we maybe took a slightly sort of sideways look at the question of money and giving by thinking, first of all, about the problem that money has for each one of us, which is that it blinds us. There is something about money that distorts our view of ourselves and of the world and even of God, because in the end, like Pharaoh, it sets itself up as that sort of rival God in our hearts and lives. This week we're doing something, I think, which is maybe equally, or from another angle, a sideways look at the question of money and giving in particular, which is to try and think together from that passage in Luke 18 about how not to respond to God with our wallets. How not to respond when you write down on that sheet of paper what your envisaged giving, if you're a regular member here, what your envisaged giving for 2024 might be. Here's how not to do it, if you like. Please do take away that leaflet and think about it and pray about it, but think also about how not to fill that form in, how not to put it in the envelope and return it. This Pharisee is given for us in part, I think, to show us how not to respond to God with our wallets. And on the face of it, certainly in Jesus' day, people first of all would have thought, that's crazy to say this isn't a how not to guy. This guy is showing all the signs of responding rightly, as people thought in Jesus' day. The Pharisees, before Jesus comes along, really, the Pharisees are not the pantomime villains that we often perceive them to be, giving us a boo hiss when they come on stage, because they're obviously in the wrong. Pharisees, I think I heard a talk 20 or so years ago, which described them as the religious Richard Bransons of their generation. Probably you might say today something like an Oprah Winfrey type of person. So that they weren't the priests who, people always have a thing against authorized religious leaders like priests. They were good lay people serving God wholeheartedly. And everyone who looks at them would think they're getting it right. They're inspirational for the rest of us. We might not be able to be like them. I could never do what Oprah does. But there's something about her that sort of, people say that she smells really nice when they meet her. I heard that in an interview. I don't know why I mentioned that. But that sense of, wow, they're kind of inspiring for the rest of us. That would have been how the Pharisees were perceived in Jesus' day. And when you see what he's actually doing, in terms of money and giving, 10% of his income, like that. Am I coming through on a microphone somewhere? Sorry. 10% of his income. Now, a very blunt tool. If our church family was, all of us received the sort of median income in the UK, and everyone on our electoral roll gave 10% of that, our church finances would be solved overnight. 10% of our income is an extraordinary number for us today. That sort of money in church, I think churches are down at about 2% on average. So this guy is doing everything right with his giving, it seems. How can we say that this is how not to? Well, in one sense, it's obvious. He's giving 10% of his income, and he goes away from his prayer outside of God's family, not justified before God. If all of us, in response to that leaflet and our invitation, started giving 10%, but did it like this guy, it would be a disaster of untold proportions. It might look great. Our PCC meeting might go really well. Wow, we could spend millions. But if we follow this guy, giving 10% but ending outside of God's family, disaster. And what is the issue? Why is he sort of ending up on the outside? It's not because he's giving 10% or because he's fasting twice a week. Those are good things for him to do. It's because in the end, he has a far deeper issue that, if you like, his giving and his fasting and his religious observance is papering over, is covering up for him. In the end, his giving is really about himself rather than his God. I think that's what's going on. Luke, Jesus, as he tells the story, is almost cartoonish. He almost says, there in verse 11, the Pharisee, it says in my version, stood by himself and prayed. You could almost translate that he prayed to himself. His prayer, his whole attitude wasn't worshipping God, but serving himself. He's got a deeper problem. So even though on the surface he looks like, smells great, looks great, wonderful, his heart is warped and twisted. If you've been around this church a few years, I remember Nick, our previous vicar, used to tell this story quite a lot, and it's such a powerful one that I haven't found a better illustration of this. It's a story that the Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon used to tell in his ministry in the 19th century. This is how the story goes. Once upon a time, there was a king who ruled over everything in a land. One day, there was a gardener who grew an enormous carrot. He took it to his king and said, "My lord, this is the greatest carrot I've ever grown or ever will grow. Therefore, I want to present it to you as a token of my love and respect for you." The king was touched and discerned the man's heart. So as he turned to go, the king said, "Wait, you are clearly a good steward of the earth. I want to give a plot of land to you freely as a gift, so you can garden it all." The gardener was amazed and delighted and went home rejoicing. But there was a nobleman at the king's court who overheard all this, and he said, "My, if that is what you get for a carrot, what if you gave the king something better?" The next day the nobleman came before the king, and he was leading a handsome black stallion. He bowed low and said, "My lord, I breed horses, and this is the greatest horse I've ever bred or ever will. Therefore I want to present it to you as a token of my love and respect for you." But the king discerned his heart and said, "Thank you," and took the horse and simply dismissed him. The nobleman was perplexed, so the king said, "Let me explain. The gardener was giving me the carrot, but you were giving yourself the horse." You see the point. That Pharisee had an open wallet, but really before God a closed heart. So though he looked like he was giving something generously to God, he really wasn't. He was using his giving and his fasting and his religious observance to get God to do what he wanted him to do. He was approaching God transactionally. I think that's the point. But the problem for us is, okay, that's how not to do it. But how do you know you're doing it that way? Because remember last week, money blinds us. So it's reasonable. We can't get inside this Pharisee's sort of mind, but it's reasonable to think he thought that he was doing everything right, that he was so blinded, he's sort of warped in his thinking, that he didn't realize. So how can you know if when you fill in that return and you pledge a certain amount given that you're really responding to God and not just serving yourself? Well, I think there are two clues in this part of the Bible. Firstly, in the Pharisee himself, which is that just consider his attitude to himself, that we get sort of a pen portrait of here. Firstly, his comparison with others. You hear how he prays, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers. Now, this is a bit of a cartoon portrait, but pick up the implication, I suppose. I'm really doing better than that person. If, when it comes to anything in our lives as followers of Jesus Christ, there is that sort of, well, I'm not quite as bad as them, or I'm getting on a bit better than them, we're not like that group, if you expand it to groupthink, that maybe is a bit of a sort of warning light on the dashboard. That the way that you're approaching your relationship with God isn't for God's sake, but for your own. To put God to some extent in your debt. And think too that this man is basically praying up in front of everyone, unlike the tax collector at a distance. There's something about him that wants to be noticed, that wants to be thanked, that wants to be honoured for his wonderful act of service in fasting and giving like he does. And again, maybe that's another sort of dashboard warning. Are there areas in your life where you are giving of your time, your energy, your money, and no one else knows about it? And does that feel like that shouldn't be the case? I should be being thanked for this task. I should be being honoured in some way. So there's something about your attitude to yourself that maybe offers a kind of warning if you're going the Pharisees' way rather than a better way, which we'll come on to. But the other clue as to how you can know if this is your problem, if this is where you are, is in that little interaction that Jesus has with his disciples about those children. Towards the end of the passage, people were also bringing babies to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. When the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. And again, in Jesus' day, that wouldn't have been that surprising, because babies, children, were nobodies. One of the histories of this period that talks about this has the title, When Children Became People. Really, lots of people have pointed this out. Before the Christian Revolution, in the wider Greco-Roman world, children, literally speaking, weren't counted as people. Now that sounds strange. We can't get our head around that, really. When you look at some of the devastating scenes in the Middle East, to say that we can write off some of the devastation that was only against children is morally absurd and obscene to our ears. But in Jesus' day, it was perfectly normal for people to think like that, for complicated reasons we don't have time to go into. But the point is that by the standards of the day, Jesus is being extravagant in his reaching out to these children. The disciples can't hack it. They can't make sense of that. Waste the time. And maybe that is the other clue. I don't think this is random that Luke tells us about the children coming to Jesus at this point, having given us this picture of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It really is an outworking of that first story. See, in the end, the generosity that God is interested in is not the surface level show and impressiveness of the Pharisee. It's about something far, far deeper and far, far wider, about generosity that extends to every part of our lives. You might be the most generous person with your wallet, but in the rest of your life, there isn't a kind of connection. Let me try and give you a few examples of what I mean. The way you treat other people. I mean, quite literally here, the way that these disciples treat children is miserly compared to the generosity that Jesus is looking for. If you don't have time for other people, unless they can give you the things that you want them to. I mean, children are still, I think, a good sort of test case for this. Children are messy and disruptive. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't follow the rules that we've sort of established in our little cliques and subgroups. They mystify us. They're difficult to understand. Do we really want to have them too involved in our lives, in our life as a church? But the extravagant generosity of Jesus would say, yes. But maybe that's a bit of a warning light. Other people, maybe particularly children. Or think about your time. Do you just want to be someone who's in control of your diary? And your instinct when people want to kind of have some of your time, whether to talk to you or whether to sign you up for something, to be involved, is, I haven't really got the time for you. That's not in line with my plans for my life. Seems to me that the generosity that God is after here is a generosity of our diaries. Or think about what you might call your personal relational economy, by which I mean, in all of our lives, in different ways, our temptation is to track who we owe stuff to or who owes us stuff. In The American Office, there's a character who takes this to the absurd conclusion, but as so often comedy sort of does that. He's a character who always knows who owes him what and what he owes them. In a monologue that he gives in the office, he says this: you give me a gift, bam, thank you note. You invite me somewhere, pow, RSVP. You do me a favor, wham, favor returned. And he looks at the camera and narrows his eyes and says, do not test my politeness. Now, again, that's absurd, but I think we know this sort of thing. Well, I've invited them for dinner every time and they've never invited me back. Or I've done this, that, and the other for them and barely a word of thanks. Now, of course, there's a level in which politeness is a good thing. But if you spend your time tracking who owes you what or what you owe to someone else, you're miserly rather than living the generosity that God intends. So, how not to respond to a call to give? This Pharisee is a terrible test case. But perhaps he's touching closer to home than we want to admit. Or at least here's some ways which you can sort of take and think about. Is this true for me? Am I more like this Pharisee than I want to admit? Then I suppose the question is, how do you become radically generous? How do you become like Jesus? In giving your life and your time for the sake of anyone in need, whoever they are. Whether they're children that the rest of the world doesn't think are even people, or those in your life who no one else has time for, or then particularly this question of money. How can you open your wallet with an open heart, whatever your gift and giving looks like? Well, in some ways, come back next week, because in the rest of chapter 18, which we're going to explore next week, I think Jesus goes on to develop that very point. But actually, we have the sort of sketch laid out, given to us in that tax collector right back at the beginning of our passage. The tax collector is maybe the biggest shock of the story, because the tax collector in Jesus' day would have been the worst sort of person that anyone in respectable, polite society could think of. In Jesus' day, the Romans were the occupying power. They were the colonizing people, and some of the Jewish colonized folk responded to them being colonized by siding with them, working for them. The comparisons often made between the tax collectors of Jesus' day and those in Vichy France in World War II, those who collaborated with the Nazi occupying forces and even sold their own countrymen, if they were Jewish, into the Nazis' hands. That kind of moral outrage is how you would think about a tax collector in Jesus' day. We don't think of taxmen in quite those negative terms today, even if they don't have the best reputation. But in Jesus' day, these were the worst sorts. The sorts who your stomach would sort of turn at the thought of. Remember, if the Pharisees are the religious Oprah Winfreys, then it is an extraordinary shock that the tax collector goes home justified and the Pharisee doesn't. But that's the point. When we come to appreciate that God is so much more generous and loving and kind towards people who do not deserve anything from him. It's not that the tax collector really is a good guy who deserves God's favor. It's that before God, both tax collector and Pharisee fall far, far short. They're miles away from God's heart. And yet God goes to them in love and kindness and self-sacrifice. Now here's the challenge for us, I think. If we come here today and come to the Lord's table and come to worship him thinking, well, really, I know I'm a bit more deserving than that, then we might find that in the end we walk away from God with nothing, like that Pharisee. But if we come recognizing that I fall to my knees like that tax collector should and does, and say, God, have mercy on me. There's nothing about me that merits your kindness and love. Any plaques there are around heralding my generosity and money, any reputation that I have far and wide for being a good sort of person, any literally giving away of thousands of pounds I might have done, that doesn't buy me anything with you, God. But I receive your love and kindness as a completely free gift. If that in the end is how you're coming today, then you can go away like that tax collector, assured of God's favor and love, completely undeserved. And to the degree you understand that and take that extraordinary gift from God to you, to the heart of your being, to that extent you'll be able to give from yourself for the sake of others. Whether that's your money or your time, or not holding grudges, keeping short accounts, filling your diary with service rather than being served. If you know a God who owes you nothing, but has given you everything in Jesus Christ, to that extent, you can give yourself and everything you have for the sake of others, and do so joyfully. Let's take a moment in our own hearts to consider how we want to respond in prayer and in worship, and in considering our own generosity in all kinds of ways. And then we're going to come to God in our prayers of intercession.